work for the Housing Development Consortium. And we have Emma and Patience who are on HDC staff with us here today. We're fortunate to have Alistair Jackson, who's a principal at O'Brien 360, and Sean Harrington, who is the Project and Evergreen Standard Manager from Commerce, joining us. I want to especially thank Sean for allowing a little more time on the public comment and allowing for this opportunity to happen for us to really connect around ESDS 4.0, and for Alistair for all his extra work in getting ready for today. I do have just a few things that I want to share with you. We have some objectives for this session. We want to present the key changes from ESDS version 3. We want to talk a little bit about the intent behind those changes. And then we want to answer, to the degree we have time, any clarifying questions from attendees. And we were so thankful many of you filled out the survey, which gave us some really good content to work from. So really, truly appreciate that. And thank you again for all who are joining today. Then the only thing I'd like to do is just lay out a few ground rules. We've had some challenges technologically in the last few days with backfeed and other things happening. And we also have just so many people that we want to make sure that we have quality presentation capability. So please stay muted, and we will also be controlling that. Some of us are control freaks, sorry, but it's pretty important. And if you want to download the ESDS 4.0 public comment, go to the link or search on that heading. And then use the chat box, please, to ask any clarifying questions. We will have plenty of folks monitoring the chat. And then also, just a reminder, the new timeline for submitting comments to Jennifer at Commerce will be February the 12th. So with that behind us, it's my pleasure to introduce you now to Alistair Jackson, the one and only Alistair, who has been deep in this for a long time and is really a major partner with all of us working on these issues. So Alistair, I'm going to let you take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Marty. I appreciate it and appreciate the opportunity to have a chance to chat a little bit with everybody. And thanks to HDC for creating this opportunity and setting this lunch and learn up. I know that I'm certainly grateful for the opportunity, and I know Sean is as well. Just to really hopefully clarify a few things as far as this next version of Evergreen's concerned, really to tee up the public comment. The more informed you are, then the better the quality of your feedback, and the more we can respond to things as we kind of move into the final draft of the program. So the goal here, and we're pretty much on track, well done, Mr. Koistra, is to give you a kind of general overview and then walk through the sections in anticipation that section 1, the integrative process section, is going to be raising some questions for people, particularly coming out of V3. We'll be spending a little more time on that section than the rest, but I do want to walk sort of quickly through each of the sections and hopefully leave at least sort of 15 or 20 minutes at the end to answer some questions. So if you would, we're going to keep everybody muted through the whole session. If you have questions that you want clarification of anything particular, either that you hear me say, see on a slide, or if there's something specific from your review of the public comment draft, the chat's the place to put them, and we're going to kind of keep track of those and hopefully be able to answer the trending questions at least today. But we will follow up on all the others as part of the public comment response further on down the road, and then hopefully closing out at 1:30. So with that, I'm actually going to pass it over to Sean Harrington, who is the Evergreen Sustainable Development Standard Manager and has kind of led the development process as far as version 4 is concerned, and he's going to give you that kind of general overview and welcome from the Department of Commerce. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to you, Sean.
Thanks, Alistair. As Alistair says, I'm Sean Harrington. I caretake the ESDS here at the Department of Commerce. I've been involved in this process since, or involved in Evergreen since just a little bit before 3.0 went live. I inherited the caretaker position from my predecessor, Dana Harris. And I have a background in environmental studies and environmental science. So I'm coming at this from I come at things from a little bit of a data-oriented position. Can I get the next slide, please? I just wanted to reiterate that we do have a public hearing scheduled on the 11th of February. We'll be providing an online platform for folks to be able to come in, give their commentary. We'll be walking through some of it at that time as well. And I hope that through what we do today, there's a significant amount of people's concerns are alleviated. And then that will, as Alistair says, increase the quality of the comments that are made and increase our ability to actually actively address people's concerns in the final draft. Next slide, please. So just a really quick general overview of the 4.0 process. So we've learned a lot from version 3. I've been tracking, I'm the principal person. I'm sure a lot of you have at least seen my email address, if not heard my voice. I'm the principal person at Department of Commerce who answers questions about Evergreen as far as compliance is concerned and interpretation is concerned. So I've been tracking a lot of questions, a lot of comments, a lot of concerns that people have had, things that people have asked for waivers for, that sort of thing over the whole process, and trying to keep that front of mind when we've been working on version 4. Hopefully some of that will show up in what we were talking about today. You may recognize yourself in some changes, but if not, hopefully in looking at the overall standard in and of itself, you'll be able to see some welcome changes. Part of the reason for going on to version 4 is, of course, the enactment of the Washington State Energy Code 2018 version. That bumps up the energy requirements quite considerably for all projects, and we wanted to make sure that Evergreen is mindful of that. You'll see a little bit of that today when we talk in section 5 of Evergreen. Another thing that I wanted to make note of is that this process started before COVID-19 hit, and it's happened. Clearly it's happened during the course of the COVID-19 epidemic. A lot of the things that we're looking at that we've put in Evergreen 4.0 will have to be open. We accept that we'll have to be open and flexible, at least during the period of COVID-19 until we get this whole thing under control. Hopefully when we get back to something approaching normal, we'll be able to really act on a lot of the stuff that we really want to act on. And you'll see that in Evergreen 4.0. But again, keep in mind, we are open to flexing a bit regarding all of some of the catastrophic changes that have been made or that have had to have been made during the course of the pandemic. The optional points you'll see, if you've looked through the Evergreen standard so far, we still haven't published specific point values. We've indicated our feeling on the value of the different criteria by giving them a low, medium, or high for the most part. As part of your commentary that you provide, we are definitely open to people voicing whether they think that should be 2 points, 3 points, 8 points, that sort of thing. Again, that's certainly that's part of the commentary that you can provide. And Evergreen is a living standard. We don't have to wait until a next version to make significant changes to. We could conceivably be adding points at some point in the near future, hopefully not immediately, but we can move to a version 1.0, sorry, 4.1 or 4.2 or something like that if people present really great ideas for additional stuff, additional optional criteria. As far as resources and tools are concerned, we are looking at publishing quite a bit more this time around as far as guidance for folks. A lot of the stuff, a lot of the concern that we've had in the past has been regarding, well, my project is, X, or my project it follows along a specific course that isn't necessarily, I don't see it reflected in the standard. So we'll be providing guidance. Those documents will be published in the future on the Evergreen website, and will hopefully go a long way to helping people navigate through and getting to good outcomes. As far as the timeline is concerned, this is the last thing that I want to talk about right here, is that as has been said before, we will be having the online hearing on the 11th of February. The official close of the public comment period is then the 12th of February. We'll be taking, I am currently working on collating all of the comments that we've had so far and looking into how we can address those in the draft. In that period after the 12th, we'll be doing that in a much more in-depth way and seeing what tweaks we can make, what maybe has to wait for the next version. And then I'm hoping that'll take about a month, and then in early to mid-March, we'll be able to produce and publish the finalized version of Evergreen 4.0. It's a little bit quick, understood, but a lot of the stuff that Alistair is going to be talking about, particularly in section 1, really makes us feel that we want to get this out for folks to be able to start working on it as quickly as possible, or as soon as possible. So with that, Alistair, I believe I can pass the mic back to you.
Awesome. Great. Thanks, Sean. I appreciate it. I think it was a great overview of where things stand. And I think there are a lot of plans. You'd mentioned lessons learned from version 3, and certainly as far as section 1 is concerned, I think there were some clear takeaways that were a combination of best intentions, maybe overreaching a little, and then perhaps not having the opportunity to really inform and educate people about what we were trying to do and how to use the tools that we were providing as far as version 3 was concerned. So I think, the thing that was clear was that those expectations and the available resources quite often were not well aligned. And this is something that we've talked about a lot here in the community. The fact that while we recognize there's this need for early planning and early analysis in order to be able to get the best out of our opportunities and the available resources, and drive better performance and better outcomes from our buildings, the money is not necessarily there to support that in the way that we would like. And so figuring out how to create opportunities to do good planning and yet have the resources to fund it has been one of the challenging things. And the green development plan that was part of version 3, I think, wasn't as well articulated as we could have made it, that a lot of people ended up feeling like they had to put a lot of work in too early, sort of ahead of the funding process, and that posed challenges. And then while there were optional opportunities, they also had resource implications, and sometimes the outputs weren't necessarily clear in terms of how it would change the course of projects. The use of with examples of that, I think, were in a quite significant scope, not necessarily clarity about where the outcome would be, whether you were developing a very high performance project or just trying to deliver the best project, the best number of units, and meet all the requirements of Evergreen. And then one of the other places that I think we saw there was some challenge was while we were looking for more focus on verification and commissioning, in order to ensure that you got the return on your projects that you were planning on and you were investing in, there wasn't a quality assurance step. So quite often people were looking to verify compliance, to do commissioning, but where there hadn't been a clear articulation of what the outcome should look like, it was then very difficult to verify whether you'd achieved it or not. So those were all things that I think were real and tangible and things that we've looked to address, I think, in version 4. So looking overall, kind of big picture sense, section 1, the integrated process section, we're really trying to focus in similar areas, but rethink how we approach them. The mandatory criteria overall are really about building trust. And this is one of the things that we've seen in the work here locally in the exemplary building program, and which I've also seen in the work that I've been doing with enterprise on the national level with green communities, is that one of the things that really leads to better outcomes more cost effectively and cost efficiently is real-time goals, everybody feeling like they're in the loop from a communication point of view. And those are the things that really then lead to opportunities to figure out better ways to do things, go faster, deliver better, save more cost, deliver better operational outcomes. So that trust all the way through the line is what's important. And what we're trying to do is deliver a set of tools and expectations that will help deliver on that. And then in the optional criteria, kind of creating more of a multi-level approach so that you don't have to bite off too much, that there are opportunities to use the tools in a way that's effective, but a little more focused, smaller scope, different outcomes, and to be able to use those tools when it becomes applicable for you to do so. Lies on the things that we would really love to be able to be more impactful about. But decisions have to be made really early on in the process. So doing good early planning in order to be able to capitalize on opportunities to do things that are really fundamentally important for all of us. And I'm looking right this minute at HDC's vision. People live with dignity in safe, healthy, and affordable homes within communities of opportunity. And that statement actually really encapsulates what I think Evergreen is ultimately trying to do. And certainly here in the optional criteria, we're trying to focus a little more on how to deliver on those goals. Overreach and overstress on resources, on people, on staff, and so on. So that's kind of the overview. Section 1.1a, which is the section where we originally had the green development plan and those kind of early stage planning goals, has at the surface at least become probably more complex than it looked like it was in version 3. But what we've tried to do is really break it up into steps that work effectively and in line with your resource availability. So there are 2 tools, 5 steps altogether, but the 2 tools that I think are really key, you may not have seen these yet. They are now posted up at the public comment draft link on the Commerce website. So you can get access to these now. I'm not going to show them today because they're sizable documents and there's quite a lot to talk through. But I think if you read through them, you'll have an opportunity to understand what it is we're trying to do. And essentially, the first step, the project priorities survey, is trying to do 2 things. One, it's trying to establish a level of accountability in the housing provider organization for commitment to Evergreen, because one of the things we've seen is that quite often responsibility for Evergreen ends up being held outside the organization or at a level where there may be quite a bit of turnover, and so there's a lack of continuity from project to project, year on year, and so on. So really establishing an executive level advocate within the organization for meeting the goals of Evergreen. And then to really take time inside your organization, and I think that's a key thing, is this early step is not intended to be done by consultants who have to be brought in and paid. This is really focusing internally on your staff, your customers, your partner organizations, to know what your goals are, understand what it is you're trying to deliver, what your capacity is, and what challenges you face, so that you're primed early on to be able to really make the best choices and the best opportunities. Then that's a sort of pre-application phase. At the funding application phase, you go to step 2. There's a document called the Green Development Framework, which is actually a 2-stage tool. At the outline stage, you're filling out a fairly high level set of questions, building the framework for a plan, which you will implement once you win your funding award. But the intent is that there's a planning step that takes place, and typically here we're talking about the sponsor organization and probably the architect. And that may be the only key people involved in that conversation at this stage. You might bring in a building performance analyst or somebody who can, particularly if you're looking at a high performance project, you may want to add that step as well. And so that's goes in with your application, along with some commitment that you know you're going to meet the mandatories with your project design, and that you have an outline of where you're going to earn the points you need. And then step 3 is to evolve that outline into a plan. So filling it out, and that happens post-award. It happens as you bring on your team. And then that is submitted with the EPP, so that becomes part of your kind of submission pre the contract stage in the project. And then after that, the following up steps are then to work the plan. And there's a component that's about documentation. This is the kind of quality assurance step. And then there's a component that's about construction management, and that's both quality assurance and quality control. So those are the components of this 1.1A, which I think is going to be one of the key pieces of this process. Oh, I think I just skipped a slide. No, maybe not. Okay, so people have seen this slide. I'm going to hover on it only briefly. It's one of my favorites when we have this conversation. Really just to say here that if you look at this curve, which defines 4 things, the 4 key lines in it, the blue line being the ability to impact cost and functional capabilities, decreases as we move through from pre-design through into occupancy. The second line is the red line. The cost of making design changes increases along that same time frame. The black line is our traditional design and delivery process. Most of the effort coming in the CD phase rather than early on. And the 4th line, the brown line, is the one that indicates that if we put more effort into the early stages, we get to better outcomes for lower cost. And this has been demonstrated repeatedly. It's one of the big takeaways that Enterprise had from the Green Communities program, is that projects that really succeeded and really delivered performance and outcome, not just in terms of energy performance or water conservation, but also in terms of impacts on residents, that good early planning and good early analysis is the thing that made the difference in people's ability to deliver cost effectively. So it's a component that I think is really critical, and we just need to figure out how we can do it within the resource constraints that we're dealing with at the moment. I'm hoping that my slide is, there we go, going to advance. Hopefully you are seeing. I apologize. I'm just realizing that my slides here on my monitor are not advancing. So are you seeing the ESDS version 4 section 1 workflow slide?
Yes.
Yes. Awesome. Yeah, for some reason my side monitor seems to have frozen on the general overview slide. Okay, so here's a kind of quick timeline layout of how these pieces fit in the flow. So that same project delivery flow from pre-design through schematic design, design development, contract documents, procurement, construction administration, and occupancy across the bottom. And so the tools, as we're defining them, the project priorities survey, really in the pre-design stage and very much focused internally. Quite honestly, once you've done this survey once, it may become a kind of owner's project requirement document that doesn't have to be reinvented every project, that it just needs a little tweaking from one project to the next. So it's a level of effort that'll be not insignificant the first time around, but after that, it should become an iterative process. That goes in partly as a sort of pre-qualifier. I think it's partly going to give the Department of Commerce an understanding of the capacity, your capacity and focus as an organization, and what the issues are that you're dealing with and trying to address. Step 2 is then this green development outline. And again, at the point that you're bringing the architect on board, quite often that's somebody you're familiar with, you've worked with closely, they know who you are and how you work. But it's about outlining and building the plan, which you'll then implement post-award. So it may not even involve knowing everybody who's going to be on your team, but it is about understanding what capabilities should be on your team. So if you know your team members, that's great. If you don't, you maybe at least be identifying what capacity you need, who you're going to have to track down. That's the step that goes in with your funding application. And then once you have the award, you then move to step 3, where you build out that plan, develop your Evergreen project plan. Those are all submitted in the timing of that EPP ahead of your final contracting. And then we move into the work of then documenting the design decisions that are going to get you to your, not just your Evergreen goals, but your overall building project goals. That works obviously through into the construction documents, contract documents. And then the construction management phase is about making sure that everybody on the construction side of the teams understands what the goals are, understand what the commissioning process looks like, what has to be achieved, how we're going to deliver it, how we're going to test it, and so on. And then there's an optional credit then that occurs in the occupancy phase, which is to do post-occupancy evaluation, understand what worked, understand what's not working so well, what are the impressions of residents, and that becomes feedback into the next step, the next phase of the next project. The last comment I'll make here, I borrowed a slide actually from the exemplary building program, early integrative design guideline work that HDC is working on at present, because one of the things that popped out to me from that experience is the importance of timeline integration, so that you don't just think of Evergreen as a timeline that stands independent of everything else. Obviously, it's in line with your funding timeline, but there are all sorts of other decision milestones that can be impacted by and can have an influence on your Evergreen decision-making process. So the more you're able to really integrate those things together, the better. So that essentially is what the integrative process credit is about. I think the thing that I really want to communicate more than anything else is that there's a real intent to make sure that the level of effort is appropriate to where you are in the funding process. I will also say that if you're looking for a high performance project, so if you're pursuing additional tax credit points by pushing energy performance, or if you're pursuing the UHE, the ultra high efficiency funding for a project, that you will actually need to find additional resources to do this early analysis work and actually move the whole thing forwards, because it's not realistic to think you can achieve those high performance goals if you don't actually do more than just planning, but actually reach into the analysis phase early on. Anyway, I really look forward to hearing feedback through the clarification questions, and then once we see the public comment statements, feedback, because I'm hoping that we're going to be able to craft this into a really successful process for everybody. So moving on to section 2, I'm seeing a little lag, but hopefully you're seeing the section 2 slide. So this is location and neighborhood fabric. Some changes. I think that the mandatory criteria, the main focus here is really to make sure that Evergreen is guiding people towards selecting viable sites that are going to provide the things that we see as fundamental in terms of creating great places for housing. And so that's really the intent. I think one of the things that came up in version 3, and there was certainly some feedback on this, is whether Evergreen requirements might be pushing people to select sites that weren't necessarily sites that set people up for success. So I think that we've given some attention to that. I think there's a reality that very often site selection is more driven by cost and availability and other factors. But I think it's important that we all remain cognizant of the fact that sites that really support multimodal transportation options, that have access to services, access to open space, are all critical success factors for the people we're serving. At the same time, there are some project types that make that challenging. And so I think we've tried to accommodate that for home ownership models, for single family rental models, acquisition and rehab, obviously where the building you're looking at is wherever it's located. You don't necessarily have the same freedom to choose a site, and also rural models. So I think the mandatory criteria have some more flexibility built into them to accommodate those realities. And then on the optional criteria side, we are really, again, focusing on resident well-being. How can we enhance the health and well-being impacts of our residents? There is still a focus on pushing people to find sites that better provide for multimodal transportation choices, that better provide for access to other services, that increase neighborhood economic opportunity. You know, there's an aspect of bringing a community in a affordable housing development into a neighborhood that actually may help create new economic opportunities in those neighborhoods. And I think that's part of what we're looking at to some extent in the ideas of density and so on. And then the other thing that I think has come out really is a slightly unexpected but response to the pandemic, is a focus on making sure that we're providing infrastructure to support remote work and schooling. One of the things that's become more important, as we've seen this year, is if people don't have access to broadband, that has posed a real challenge. If we build buildings that don't support the potential for broadband in the future, even if it's not available, particularly in like a rural location, then that may be a disservice over the long term. So those are sort of the main focuses here as far as the location and neighborhood fabric section is concerned. As I say, I think the thing that probably stands out most is that the version 4 does try to accommodate the different needs of different project types, perhaps better than it did in the past. Moving on to section 3. So site improvements. In the mandatory criteria, not not a lot of changes. One of the things that shifted, and actually it was in the optional criteria in version 3, I listed it here under mandatory because the credit for stormwater management, which was a challenging one for a lot of people, few people actually took it up. We removed the stormwater management credit altogether because essentially the code, wherever you are located, now really fully and adequately addresses the needs and opportunities for effective stormwater management. It's one of the places where state of Washington is fairly well advanced, and both the Eastern Washington and Western Washington stormwater management manuals really cover all the options. So we felt it was appropriate to remove that. On the optional criteria, I think hopefully people will be happy to see that we've built in more clarity of what the requirements are and more flexibility. So in the drought tolerant species requirement, for example, reducing the requirement for credit from 100% to 90% really gives you that little bit of flexibility to be able to accommodate a planting palette that provides you some options and doesn't rigidly require you to do everything as native or adaptive. I think another one that will be very popular is that we've eliminated the requirement for drip irrigation. It's still preferred and recommended in some locations, but a lot of feedback regarding particularly maintenance concerns and the challenges of knowing when a drip system is broken, if it's leaking, and so on. Things that we've taken on board. And so the focus now is on delivering high performance irrigation efficiency, but not necessarily prescribing systems that your operations and maintenance team may not feel comfortable implementing and managing over the long term. The other thing that I think you'll see in this category is exemption for some water consumption uses. So water that's used for establishment, water that's used for food production, fire suppression areas. So in some areas, people are required to maintain irrigation in fire buffers. And so those are things that are all accommodated. The same with vegetated athletic fields. You know, we're wanting to promote activity, have good quality outdoor space for people to be active. And sometimes you need to irrigate those surfaces in order to make them both functional and durable. And so those things are accommodated in this version. Water conservation, section 4. So here we are seeing modest changes. I think probably one criterion in particular. The significant changes that with adoption of the 2018 Universal Plumbing Code and changes in the Energy Code have led to prescription as far as minimum fixture performance in Washington State is concerned. And so those have sort of established as mandatory criteria as far as fixture performance is concerned. And then the other mandatory criteria largely are focusing on leak detection and pressure testing where it's meaningful. So particularly in rehab projects, although there is still a case, and somebody did raise a question about whether it was worth doing leak detection in new construction. And I can tell you from experience that it is. And even though it's obviously a requirement, that there's still some value to taking extra steps from that point of view. So those are the sort of things that are embedded in the mandatory criteria for water conservation. In the optional criteria, we're seeing a little more focus on metering and sub-metering because we're seeing really significant impacts on water consumption and as a result, operational savings through effective metering strategies. But there is a need to plan to use those meters rather than to just install them. And then also still maintaining interest in including infrastructure for future reuse. So finding really cost-effective ways to try and design our buildings so that we can back in the use of salvaged water, recycled water, non-potable water where it can be provided one way or another. The big item that I mentioned, the criterion 4.05, which was the hot water distribution credit, which was tied to the fixture performance credit in version 3. Those two have now been separated. So your fixture performance efficiency points are independent of how you design your hot water distribution system. Part of the reason for that is that the code is going to push you towards better distribution system design anyway. So again, we're leaning more on the fact that the code has moved to the point that we're really seeing the base requirements being much more effective if they're properly implemented. I'll say again, it's still one of the biggest area of energy savings, and certainly has an impact on water conservation as well, to really look at the efficiency of your domestic hot water distribution. So it's still something to be conscious of, but in recognition of the challenge it had posed for projects under version 3, we've separated those two. And then there's also an optional criterion that looks at resilience measures. I think we're increasingly conscious of the impacts that natural disasters can have on, particularly on marginalized communities and people who are financially challenged and disadvantaged. And so looking at ways that we can make sure that our buildings can meet basic needs in the event of a natural disaster that might interrupt the things that we take for granted, like water supply, are things that we should be thinking for and incentivizing people to plan for. Section 5, energy efficiency. So always a big one. In this case, as Sean mentioned, we're moving into a new code cycle with version 4, and at some point we'll actually move into that code cycle. Should have happened last November. Then it was going to happen in February, and now maybe it's going to be put off a little longer. But one way or another, we will soon be under the 2018 codes. They are a significant step up, and I think the recognition was that because they are a significant step up, it's no longer realistic or reasonable to push affordable housing beyond the code requirements. So the news is that the mandatory requirement for energy performance is to meet the code, including thorough commissioning. The commissioning requirement in the code has been enhanced with the 2018 code. And it will and won't be implemented completely in every jurisdiction. So the requirement is that on Evergreen projects that you do follow the letter of the code as far as commissioning is concerned as well. On the rehab side, the mandatory requirement is similar to what it was in version 3, except that it has been updated slightly to meet the current state weatherization standards. And so that's just leveraging, again, resources and so on to be consistent, so that the Evergreen requirement is equivalent to the state requirements for weatherization projects. So you'll see that. And then the other thing that has popped out and a few people have queried is the PV readiness. So a mandatory requirement that in new construction that you meet the code option for photovoltaic readiness in the building. This one, I've heard some commentary on it that it has cost implications, planning implications, all of which may be true. But the reason that it's in this category is really twofold. One is that the state is fully committed to a clean energy transition, and that's going to mean quite a lot of market restructuring. The lesson we learned from past incentives for solar energy in the state is that ended up being public resources that went to the hands of people who could afford it. And so what we're trying to do here is build in the infrastructure to our buildings so that as the market restructures and new opportunities develop for solar power, that people who can't afford it have access to opportunity, that we have buildings that are already ready to go. So it's only a matter of finding plug and play solutions and finding funding for those rather than having to try and back in the infrastructure into an existing building. So it's really about equity as much as anything, and about recognition that we're in a state which is moving very progressively towards a clean energy economy. And we want affordable housing residents to be able to access the benefits of that. The optional criteria really follow on that same initiative. Again, we're really trying to focus on moving people away from fossil fuels and setting affordable housing projects up to be able to capitalize on opportunities that come with the clean energy legislation, the clean buildings requirements, so that as resources are made available to move the built environment in the right direction as far as the state initiative's concerned, that affordable housing is fully able to capitalize on those opportunities. Okay, section 6, materials. This one, I'll admit, when I first looked at the criteria here, I was caught aback because it looks like a lot of stuff. The materials category always tends to be a little bit of a soft one, thinking about salvaged materials, recycled materials, and so on. I think the shift here is really, in the mandatory particularly, is really to focus on ensuring that we use available, healthy finished materials in our buildings, not just finishes. It does move into some structural and thermal materials as well, but in particular that we really do the best job we can to try and minimize the exposure of our residents to toxic emissions. And I know there's been some question about the recycled content disclosure criterion from a couple of people who've reviewed the draft already. And I want to say that the real intent here is to be clear that we have increasing access to information about the contents of the materials that we purchase. One thing that we have not paid good attention to while we've been promoting the use of recycled materials is that the use of recycled materials is actually an opportunity for toxic materials to stow away into our buildings. And this is a relatively new awareness. And it's one of the things that I think is really critical to understand and take control of, is the fact that the recycled content in materials that we bring into our buildings may actually contain toxins. And in some cases, it may be in materials that we put right in contact with our residents. And so I think there's a little work to do on the language actually in this particular criterion, but I think it's a really important one to understand, that it's about making sure that we're not purchasing, procuring, and installing materials that are actually toxic without our knowledge. So that's the key here, and it's really consistent in its kind of support for this idea that the finished materials can have a substantial impact on the health and well-being of the people living in these buildings. On the optional criteria choice side, we are really raising the bar, creating opportunities again for people to really dig a little deeper into this healthy materials idea and make choices that are going to further enhance or reduce negative health impacts. And then the second component is focusing particularly on embodied carbon. So again, as part of the state focus on reducing impact on climate change, there's a real opportunity to make fairly straightforward choices that increasingly we're finding maybe zero cost choices to reduce the embodied carbon footprint of our buildings. There will be tools to support this. We're fortunate to be in a location where there's very good documentation of the climate impacts of concrete in particular here. And between the Carbon Smart Materials palette, which is an online tool, and EC3, which is another online tool, there are actually some really good tools to support good decision making when it comes to concrete mixes that can have a really significant effect on embodied carbon emissions without having a significant effect on the budget. Okay, getting a little latency here, I think, but here we go. So moving on to section 7, healthy living environment. The changes here are fairly modest. Some clarification again. I think the most significant change that certainly pops out as far as I'm concerned is on the mandatory side, the kitchen ventilation option has changed sort of pretty fundamentally, but with a caveat. And that is that it used to be that Evergreen required that kitchen range hoods were exhausted to the exterior, and that it had to be an Energy Star range hood and it had to be exhausted to the exterior. That has been adjusted primarily in recognition of the fact that we are moving into a phase where the building code requires greater envelope tightness, and that leads to concerns about getting adequate makeup air to kitchen range hood ventilation. We're also increasingly seeing people not just looking at the base code of enveloped tightness, but looking at programs like Passive House, where you're looking at very, very tight envelopes and balanced ventilation, and a high flow kitchen range hood may not serve the objectives of those programs and may not actually perform very well either. So we in version 4 are opening up the possibility of doing recirculating range hoods as long as there is adequate kitchen ventilation provided and a whole series of other requirements. But we are opening up the possibility, and this has been one that has come up as an issue several times in the past. And so I'm calling attention to it because it is an intentional change, but there are a set of requirements in order to allow the use of a recirculating range hood. I think that technology has improved significantly, and I think we're going to continue to see improvements in it because of this competing balance of tighter envelopes, balanced ventilation, even in the code now in commercial buildings and coming in residential buildings, and the need to provide good kitchen ventilation, because we're also seeing an increasing awareness of health impacts associated with small particulates like PM2.5 particles that can have a significant impact on respiratory health if they're not properly removed from the cooking area in the kitchen. There's a lot of work going on around the effectiveness of range hood ventilation at the moment in terms of trying to get more effective evacuation of those contaminants. So we're just kind of keeping the options open and trying to find more ways to deliver effective exhaust performance or contaminant removal performance, while also responding to this drive towards tighter buildings and balanced ventilation. As far as the optional criteria in this section are concerned, really, I don't think the intent has changed much from version 3, but there are some modifications and clarifications of the language in these sections, in this section. And on to section 8. And here, I think, again, the focus is on trying to clarify and improve the deliverables here, and as a result, the performance outcomes. The challenge, I think, around operations and maintenance manuals have been multiple. And again, I think clearer language and clearer requirements is really the key here. The goal with Evergreen has always been to make sure that the materials that are provided to the people who operate and maintain the building are clear and functional, that they give them all the information that they need, and that they're accessible, so you can find the information you need when you need it. And so some people have, I think, misunderstood the expectation in the past that we were asking for a separate Evergreen manual from the O&M documents that come from the general contractor. I think the real intent here is to integrate the two, so that what you end up with is something that's very targeted and what people need to know in terms of operating the building, and that they can find that information quickly and easily, so it's more user-friendly. I think, actually, again, here, I think there's still some room for clarification in the language in the public comment draft. But I do want people to understand that that's the intent, is we're not looking for duplication, that really what we're trying to do is get to the point that we have really useful tools at hand, so that people know what they need to do. They know when a system is not set up the way it's supposed to, what do they do to fix it? When the irrigation controller goes out of whack and the irrigation system is not running properly, they know how to reset it. And that those documents are always available somewhere other than locked away in a storage closet somewhere. And then on the optional criteria side, we're then sort of adding, beyond that base level, we're then adding better practice. So things that enhance the ability of people to be able to do that operation and maintenance work. And then the other area that we are still continuing to focus on in section 8 is looking at benchmarking. So this, as part of this iterative process, if you look in the project priorities survey, there are questions about what information you're using to inform your goals for your next project. Two things that are really helpful in that are benchmarking, performance benchmarking, being able to understand your utility consumption, energy, water, waste generation, having access to that information in a way that you can really look at it and understand it is a great tool to then feed into, what did we do this time? What did work? What didn't work? What are we doing on the next project as a result of that? It's also a great way to be able to look at your portfolio and say, well, with the next project, which of our existing buildings are performing well and which are not performing so well? And should we be looking at ways to find resources to improve the performance of those projects that are not working so well? Benchmarking gives you the information you need to be able to make those determinations. So again, it was in section 8. Not consistently implemented or understood, I think, and hopefully in version 4 we're going to see that clarified and hopefully implemented a little more effectively. And that, I think, is a very quick walkthrough. I realize it is really high level. I'm pleased to see that I'm actually a little ahead of where I hope to be from the schedule point of view. I'm having some technical difficulties on my end from a display point of view. So I do want to move in to the clarifications section. So we'll be looking at the questions that have come in the chat. So I think if you can just bear with us for a minute, I'm going to try and sort out my technical issues here. Yeah, just give me a moment if you would. I'm actually, so patience, I'm just dropping out of the screen share for a moment so I can access the chat. And your notes.
Great.
Okay, so what are people seeing? Are they seeing my mugshot right now?
Yep, that's what we're seeing.
Okay. Okay. Great. Well, thanks. So people are aware. Patience has been tracking the chat and has sent me a list of sort of summarized questions. So I think, given that we've got some time, I'm going to work through these. And forgive me, I'll be kind of coming up with answers on the fly as I read them. But here goes. So will the version of ESDS depend on what version of energy code a project is under? Seems like version 4 tracks with the 2018 Washington Energy Code. If a project in fall round is under the 2015 Energy Code, would they stick with Evergreen version 3? Okay, that one I'm actually going to pass to Sean, because I think he's already worked through that issue. Yeah, go ahead, Sean.
Yeah, thanks, Alistair. So yeah, basically the way that we interpret a compliance is that the version of Evergreen that a project is awarded under is the version that it will stay under. So if a project came in, say for instance in fall of 2020 and was awarded funds, then as far as Evergreen is concerned, they would stay under 3.0.1. Clearly, when they go to permits, they're going to have to deal with the new energy code. And there is, I think the only effect of that would be, as far as a project would be, from our perspective, would be the project would score more highly in its I believe it's criterion 5.2a, which is exceeding the code. So I hope that helps. I hope that's clear. So yeah, if you've already got an award from like the Department of Commerce, you're going to be under 3.0. That's kind of the simplest way.
And I just want to be real clear. This is Ann Campbell, the Resource Allocation and Lending Manager, and this will be captured in the published documents. But if there is a discrepancy between the ESDS standards and the new adopted electrical code, which has been postponed until I think July, the new adopted electrical code, if it is more stringent, will be the one that succeeds.
Yeah, absolutely, and thanks for that. I guess just as a matter of clarity, Evergreen does not supersede any other code that's been put out there. If the energy code says it stipulates a certain level of efficiency, then you have to comply with that regardless of what Evergreen says. Now, if you're able to go beyond what the code says, then you're into territory where you can start scoring points on Evergreen, that sort of thing.
Great. Thanks, Sean. And I'm going to point out here, the goal here today is really trying to clarify details or the approach and intent and specific kind of language issues. I understand there are a lot of people who have strong and meaningful opinions about different aspects of Evergreen from the big picture perspective, and I urge you to share those as part of the public comment. There are some things here that I don't think it's appropriate to kind of try and tackle in this forum, but I do think it's really important that people express those opinions as part of the public comment. So I have another one here. I think even for fall applications on next January for bond deals, some of the mandatory section 1 has already passed, which is something to discuss in the Q&A. And I think it is. I mean, I think if you are under version 4, which is going to come in force in March or April, thereabout, then I think we would expect you to employ those tools and meet them. But obviously, if there is a challenge from a timing perspective, I think there can be some accommodation there. But I think understanding what the value is of doing that work, and if you can only do it partially, I think that's probably quite acceptable in the circumstances, as long as those circumstances are understood.
So Alistair, before we move on to the next question, we've had some comment in the chat that the answer that was given for what applies wasn't necessarily satisfactory. We've got at least one person who's asking what about the reverse situation where they've got permits under the 2015 code, but they haven't come in for Evergreen. They haven't been awarded yet. And from the perspective, at least of the Department of Commerce, I feel that that's sort of a unique question, a unique situation. I hope it's a unique situation, and one that we would very much like to discuss on a sort of a more one-to-one and on a case-by-case basis.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Great.
It won't be unique. All right. Well, that's good to know. Well, I guess we'll have to look into that. So thanks a lot, folks.
Great. So there's a question here: where can we find the green development outline template? So that is one of the 3 documents. If you go to the Evergreen version 4 public comment page on the Department of Commerce website, there's a link there that takes you to a box folder that has the public comment draft and both the project priorities survey and the green development framework document. So those are all available for download at that location. And there's a question: I don't understand when or what the pre-application phase is, since that isn't part of the funding application process. And again, Sean, I'm going to bump this one to you from a timing perspective, because I know we haven't fully resolved how that timing works. I could speak to the intent, but I don't know whether you want to chime in on that one.
So yeah, the intent is that you would be doing that around about the time you would be looking at submitting what previously was called a stage 1 application. So I mean, the idea generally is you're doing this work early enough in your process that it has meaningful impact, but you're not waiting until late enough in the process where you're going to have to start hiring folks, hiring consultants and architects and stuff. It's very fundamental to, you've conceived of the need for a project, and then you're going through the green the project priorities survey before you're actually laying out money for anyone who's not already in your organization. We wouldn't necessarily be no, I'm going to stop there. Yeah, we would. It's certainly more of a previously known as stage 1 thing.
Great. Thanks, Sean. Next question: will this early design result in a barrier for smaller community-based groups from being able to participate in affordable housing development? If yes, what can we do to minimize this? I think it's a great question. And I think the answer should definitely be no, it should not. I think the intent is that these tools are applied at an appropriate level. And certainly there are accommodations in the language so that if you have a small, and this was a particular thing that came up in the technical committee discussions, that where you have a well-tried model that you know works and your costs are minimal because of that, you can certainly use that in your thinking and your planning as far as these tools are concerned. Because if you've got a wheel that works for you, we don't want to make you reinvent it. The opportunity is maybe to use the tools to maybe look at that wheel from a different perspective and see if you could improve the bearings or improve the tread on the wheel or do something else different. But it should not force more cost where there isn't justification or reason. I think although it shifts level of effort, I'm still fairly convinced that with time, effective use of these tools will lower your overall cost of delivery. And certainly there's data to support that. And I think when we come to the education phase, once we get this finalized, and I'm going to step out on a limb, and I know Sean and I have talked about this a little bit, there will be some online training that walks through how best to use these tools, and hopefully that's really going to help to make sure that the way you implement them is actually effective for you. So I think I'll leave that one there. Step 1, step 2, and step 3 get review approved in some way, or is that just a matter of submitting it? And Sean, I'm going to say yes, they will certainly be reviewed and approved, but I don't know if you want to give any more specifics in that regard.
So, so we would want to see them as far as the Department of Commerce is concerned, and the other agencies that adopt ESDS may have different opinions. But as far as Evergreen, as far as the Department of Commerce is concerned, we would want to see those documents submitted as attachments to other application documents. Just as it's more of a proof of due diligence aspect. So we want to see evidence that you've done that work, and that you're well prepared to move forward into, assuming that you were to get an award from the Department of Commerce, that you'd be well prepared for actually crafting the Evergreen project plan in a pretty quick turnaround. So,
great. Yeah, thank you. The integrative credit is mandatory or voluntary under version 4 proposed. It is the first 3 steps are mandatory. So the project priorities survey, the green development outline, and the green development plan are all mandatory. The 4th component of 1.01 is the post-occupancy evaluation, and that one is optional, but the first 3 pieces are mandatory.
and if I can step in for just a moment here, Alistair, I just want to point out that those 1.01 A, B, and C are really a deep dive of what was already required under Evergreen 3.0 criterion 1.1. So it's really just, the intent is to try to help lay out a path for folks to be able to do this kind of work, where previously we said, do the work. And there wasn't a whole lot of guidance provided. I mean, there was some guidance in Evergreen, but a common thing that I was hearing is, you're asking us for an IDP. Do you have a template that we could use? Or, can you provide me with one that somebody else has produced? And there's a lot of privacy issues that are maybe not privacy is the right word, but there's a lot of issues that come up with that, where in terms of fairness, where we couldn't just say, oh, here's what Bob did last time around, or Janet, or whatever. So we can't really provide that. This is the alternative. This is us trying to lay out a little bit more clarity in the path to get you to a good place.
Yeah, so you're breaking up a little, Sean, at least for me. That I'm going to move on to the next one because this is a good technical and timeline question. When MEP, mechanical, electrical, plumbing design build approach is used, the sequence of document delivery is very challenging. I think this is a great point, and we work with this all the time. I think the thing that's key here is to make sure that the right level of documentation is available at the right stage in the process. So if you're doing MEP design build and you're not going to firm up that documentation until very late CDs or early construction, that as long as there is a solid basis of design which controls what the MEP design is actually going to achieve, that's the documentation that's expected. I think what we're trying to get away from is the idea that there's no real clear intent communicated to the design build subcontractor, and so there's no clarity about what it is you're trying to design to and what it is you're trying to deliver. That's where we see problems repeatedly across the market sector, whether it's affordable or market rate housing. So the intent here is just to make sure that there's really clear communication of what's expected of you when you deliver your design. So that means there's a document that will establish what your budget looks like, what your allowances are, that's consistent with what the design expectation is, whether that's a code design or whether it's a net zero design. Those things are clearly called out, and that should still fit within the timeline as it's described. Okay, when in this process would we need to submit waivers? Follow up, if 4.0 acknowledges that Housing First projects will likely submit a waiver for non-smoking requirements, why haven't these projects been given a blanket exemption like home ownership? Okay, so I think waivers would probably, you would probably call those out maybe in your project priority survey, certainly in your green development outline. That may be one of the assumptions that you build in to that outline. So I would say that's typically where you would first raise that issue. In terms of the blanket waiver, I'm going to pass that one to Sean.
Thanks. So I would approach this by saying there's two slightly different questions here. Home ownership versus rental, it's a very different model. We can say that this is not appropriate for a home ownership project by nature of who's owning the building. As far as Housing First and non-smoking policy, yeah, we're not really in the business of providing blanket waivers. That's kind of the long and the short of it. And as so long as waivers are actually, I mean, it's maybe I'm being a little bit flip, but it isn't that terribly complicated of a process to get a waiver. So I would just request, as soon as you've decided that you're going to be creating a building, or that you're going to be speccing a building that is going to be run on the Housing First model, as soon as you've made that decision, that would be probably the best time to just submit the waiver, as just thinking of it as a heads up. You're preparing this project, you're going to be coming in at some point, and you're going to be doing a Housing First. Just get that sorted. So
great, thanks, Sean. Okay, so this one I think really belongs more in public comment, but I will touch on it. So somebody is asking criterion 2.05A, which is mandatory, which is the access to services credit, really shrinks the map to locate a project in many areas, particularly rural. I think that the driver here is that we want to locate housing in places that does have access to services wherever that's reasonable and feasible. And the accommodation in the credit for rural areas is obviously far expanded from what it is for urban projects. But again, I think there is an accommodation. So if there's a good justification for the location that you're choosing, then that's certainly something to be called out in this early stage process. But the intent is to at least get people thinking about meeting these requirements as part of the due diligence in terms of looking at sites and looking at locations, so that you're at least weighing out the access to services against whatever other opportunity it is that you feel is really critical. And if the opportunity is that this is the only opportunity we have that we can afford, and it's going to mean we deliver affordable housing where we otherwise couldn't, then that's probably a persuasive argument. But I think it needs to be balanced against some of these other criteria. And I think that is true for a lot, particularly of the location-based credits, is that it's more about getting these things in the mindset, because they are priorities in terms of success, setting people up for success in the living situations that we're providing for them. Sites full of multimodal transit are pricing higher than, for example, a well-located site on bus rapid ride. Again, we are stewarding public resources that are scarce. Okay, so this, I think this is a misunderstanding of language. So this is a good one to note, because we need to clarify. When I say multimodal transit, I am not talking about it as a multimodal transit hub. What we're trying to do is find locations where people have more transit options. So whether they have access to rideshare, or whether they have bike lanes, or they have access to Lime scooters or Lime bikes, or walking, or regular buses, or rapid ride, all of those are great choices. So we're not looking for locations that are only adjacent to a multimodal hub necessarily. So there's a language clarification there that's really helpful. So I appreciate you calling that out. Conscious of time, we're ticking down to the last couple of minutes. Okay, so there's one with ERVs and other code requirements putting more demands on roof space. Have there been studies of whether there will be enough roof space to both meet these requirements and provide areas for PV? Seems like the points for PV might be inaccessible for infill projects as more equipment shifts to roof space. It's a great point, and it's certainly part of the analysis that needs to be done. The mandatory requirement really doesn't require a very significant area of roof space. And as I say, it's a requirement that's outlined in the new energy code as an option. It's not a requirement in the new energy code, but it is calling out to at least do that analysis and plan to include the basic infrastructure. If there is no way to balance your other mechanical roof area needs and an area for PV that meets the requirement, that would then be cause for a waiver. But I would be surprised if it's not possible to accommodate both in most circumstances.
So if I can just jump in for a minute, Alistair, I want to really stress what you just said about the waiver. We've been talking about waivers for the last several questions, or at least over the last few questions. And I just want to point out that they say mandatory. There are people on the other end of the screen, on the other side of the screen, to really take into account a well-stated case. This is not a simple, if your toes are over the line, you're out kind of thing. This is a If there is reasonable, if there's, again, well-stated, well-reasoned, reasoned reasons for a project not to be able to comply with the mandatory as stated, then we can absolutely grant a waiver. The preference would be that people do as much, potential applicants, developers do as much as they can to try to achieve the mandatory before they start considering a waiver. But, you know, except in instances where it maybe, you know, it's an appropriateness issue, like what we just talked about with the smoking waiver. But for things like this, do the best you can, and if you can't quite get there, let us know what the challenges were, and we can come to an agreement. We can make accommodations.
Great. Thanks, Sean. We're right at 1:30, so I'm going to call it a wrap there. Really appreciate all the questions. I'm sorry that I've not been able to address all of them, so please do submit them as part of your public comment. I think there's a lot of challenges we face, a lot of opportunities. Somebody said to me the other day in commenting about how much we have changed how we do our jobs and live our lives over the last 12 months, and coined or used the term constraint breeds creativity, right? And so to some extent, I think what we're trying to do is breed creativity, figure out ways to achieve both and in a lot more situations. And so hopefully with version 4, we're going to be able to help feed that creativity a little bit more. And with that, I'll pass it back to Marty to wrap us up and send us home.
Well, thank you so much, Alistair, and thank you, Sean, and Patience and team for pulling this together. And most of all, thank you, the frontline folks who are out there every day trying to make product become real on the ground. No one takes that for granted. We know how hard it is, and we really appreciate you being willing to take the time today to be here with us today. Hopefully we can continue to work together to shape the best possible practices that meet our equity crisis, our climate crisis, and our lack of access to housing crisis. So best to you all, stay safe, wear your blessed mask, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.